Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to follow the government's climate policy advisor, the member for Hughes, a man whose fingerprints are all over the government's abject failure on climate policy for the last 6 years. And it's actually a national embarrassment that will go down in history that the member for Hughes and the other tinfoil hat wearing members of the government, such as the member for New England, Senator Canavan, have driven this entire climate policy disaster in this country. Let's inject some facts into this debate, Mr Deputy Speaker. The world is warming. We are seeing earlier starts to bushfire seasons, we're seeing longer bushfire seasons and more significant bushfire seasons. We are seeing cyclones and hurricanes hitting places that never saw storms before. We are seeing significant flooding events happening in areas who have never seen it before, and we have seen more severe flooding events. In my portfolio responsibility of the Pacific, we have an entire region that is suffering an existential crisis, and those on the other side laugh about it and make jokes, as the member for Dixon did.
Order.
The truth is, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government's 2020 and 2030 targets are inadequate. The 2030 target is woefully inconsistent with the Paris Treaty goal of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees. And what makes it even more farcical is that this government won't even meet their inadequate targets. Emissions are rising every year under this government. In contrast, under Labor, emissions fell by 10%. They'll miss the Kyoto 2020 commitment and they'll miss the Paris 2030 commitment. Mr Deputy Speaker, Australia's total emissions in the last year rose by 0.6%. 0.6%. And in fact, since the emissions trading scheme was abolished, emissions in this country have risen by 1.4%. 1.4%. And the truth is, according to the government's own figures, in 2020, carbon pollution will be 1.3% above 2000 levels, not the 5% below 2000 levels, which is their own target. And they'll only hit the cumulative abatement task by using cheap accounting tricks such as the Kyoto carryover units, by Labor's renewable energy target driving down electricity emissions, by the deindustrialisation of Australia, by driving off the Australian auto manufacturing sector, leading to reduced emissions, and by the drought. That is the only way this government can claim to meet the cumulative abatement task to 2020. And the truth is that endpoints matter as much as the cumulative abatement task, and Australia's emissions in 2020 under this government, this hopeless government, will be higher than in 2000, and that is a national shame. What's happening in 2030, Mr Deputy Speaker? Well, the government's own figures again show that emissions in 2030, at best, will only be 7% below 2005 levels. Not the 26% below that they've committed to. They will be 7% below 2005 levels, and they'll miss their own woefully inadequate target by 19 percentage points. And again, they will only achieve the cumulative abatement task by electricity emissions falling due to Labor's RET, a decline in manufacturing and the drought. And then they'll make it up with their direct action dog policy, a policy thoroughly discredited, a policy where 20% of the contracts have already been cancelled, and a policy where there is no real additionality for any of the grants given under this program. They also claim that they'll cut carbon pollution through a non-existent electric vehicle strategy. In fact, their EV strategy that they're basing their abatement task on is the one that they attack Labor for having. Such is the hypocrisy of the government. They attack our EV policy and then they claim the emissions from that EV policy to hit their 2030 target. And finally, and this is my favourite, Mr Deputy Speaker, 100 million tonnes of abatement from non-existent and unspecified technology changes. They've just assumed that they're going to pluck 100 million tonnes of carbon dioxide abatement out of the air, even though they've got no basis for it and no policy for it. And I want to finish on this final point, because I want to go back to member for Hughes, the brains trust of the government on climate policy, said it doesn't matter that what Australia does because we're only 1% of global emissions. Well, the truth is, Mr Deputy Speaker, there are 15 nations whose emissions are between 1% and 2% of global emissions. Those 15 nations' emissions combined are 20%. So those 15 nations together are the second highest polluter in the world. What we do matters, and I'd ask the member to reflect on what happens if you ran that argument during World War II, where we contributed something like 1% of total armed combatants. Does that mean that our contribution didn't matter? Of course it matters. Of course it mattered, and of course it matters in this climate policy debate, where those opposite will be condemned by